2340 hours, June 23, 1944, the Mid-Atlantic Ocean, roughly 850 nautical miles west of the Cape Verde Islands. A Japanese submarine is running on the surface at 15 knots, diesels loud, hatches open to breathe air into her batteries. The watch on the bridge is scanning a horizon they cannot see, because the night is moonless and the sea and the sky are the same color. 2 hours earlier, she was tied alongside a German U-boat, taking on a brand new piece of equipment built for one purpose: to make certain nothing could ever find her in the dark again. That equipment is switched on right now, in this exact moment. The dial reads 0. It will keep reading 0 for the rest of her life, which is 33 minutes. This is not a story about a torpedo. It is not a story about a radar operator with a broken screen. This is a story about a submarine on the 6th attempt of an 18,000-mile mission that had already killed 3 of her 5 predecessors, carrying the very fix that was supposed to stop that from happening again, sailing into a trap that had been waiting for her since the day she left Singapore. 8 days earlier and 4,000 miles to the east, American Marines had gone ashore on Saipan. The task group hunting this one submarine was not a leftover patrol scraped together from spare ships. It was a deliberate, resourced decision, made in the same week as an invasion, to spend an entire escort carrier and 5 destroyer escorts on a single set of coordinates. That tells you something about how much confidence the United States Navy had, by June 1944, in a piece of intelligence that the crew about to sail into it did not know existed. Part 1. To understand what happened to I-52, you first need to understand what she was and why she existed at all. By 1943, Japan needed things only Germany could give her: radar sets, jet engine drawings, sonar technology, anti-aircraft designs. Germany needed things only Japan could give her: rubber, tin, tungsten, quinine, gold. Surface blockade runners could no longer make the crossing. Allied aircraft and Allied intelligence had made the sea lanes lethal. So the two navies turned to submarines, under a program the Japanese called Yanagi, willow, a name chosen for a tree that bends and does not break. The route ran 18,000 miles, Kure to Lorient, around the Cape of Good Hope, through waters patrolled by an enemy with air cover on both ends and code breakers in the middle. I-52 was not the first boat sent down that route. She was the 6th attempt, and by June 1944, the pattern was already written in the water for anyone willing to read it. 5 boats had gone before her. I-30 made the crossing to France in 1942 and was lost to a mine on her way home. I made the full round trip in 1943 and survived it, the only unambiguous success either navy managed. I-34 was found and sunk by the British submarine HMS Taurus in October 1943, days after leaving Singapore. I-29 completed the outbound leg, loaded German technical hardware for the trip home, and was found and sunk by the American submarine USS Sawfish, steered onto her position by the same kind of signals intelligence that was, at that moment, already reading I-52's orders. The German submarine U-511 made the crossing the other direction in August 1943 and was formally transferred to the Japanese Navy on arrival. 4 successes and failures, 2 outright losses, both tied to intelligence neither government believed the enemy could sustain against a single set of coordinates in an empty ocean, repeated for months without either side changing the doctrine. I-52 sailed anyway, because Japan's war economy did not have the luxury of waiting for a safer method. She needed German engineering more than she could afford to be cautious about how she paid for it. Consider what that means for a moment. By the time Commander Uno took I-52 to sea, his own service had already lost 2 of the 5 previous attempts at this exact route to the exact category of threat that was, at that hour, already tracking him. The information existed. It simply never reached the men who needed it, because the men who needed it were 3,000 miles from the officers doing the analysis, in a service that had no equivalent of its own 10th Fleet secret room, and no reason to believe one existed on the other side either. The boat herself was formidable on paper. I-52 was a Type C-3 cruiser submarine, 356 feet long, 2,564 tons on the surface, 3,644 tons submerged, 6 torpedo tubes forward, 2 deck guns. Japan planned 20 of this class. Wartime pressure meant only 3 were ever finished. She was laid down in March 1942 and commissioned on December 28, 1943, into the 11th Submarine Squadron at Kure. Her commanding officer was Commander Camillo Uno, 53 years old, a veteran who had previously commanded I-175 and was brought in to fit her out in November 1943. In January 1944, Admiral Minachi Koga, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, personally selected I-52 for the run to Germany. On March 10, 1944, on her maiden voyage, she left Kure by way of Sasebo, first for Singapore, then out into open ocean toward occupied France. Read the manifest and you understand exactly what this crossing meant to Japan. 2 1/5 tons of gold, 146 bars, packed into 49 sealed steel boxes, payment for German military hardware. 11 tons of tungsten, 3 tons of raw opium, 54 kilograms of caffeine, and 14 Japanese engineers riding as passengers, sent to be trained in Germany on anti-aircraft weapons and torpedo boat engines. 14 men traveling in the same hold as the metal. Part 2. Japan had her own radar warning receiver by 1944. It was called the E-27, and it listened between roughly 0.75 and 4 meters. Against the long-wave surface search radar the United States Navy had used earlier in the war, it worked. But American ships had already moved past that equipment by the time the E-27 reached the fleet in numbers that spring. The newer American sets transmitted on centimeter wavelengths. The E-27 was never built to hear. Japan knew this. It is why, when U-530 offered a transfer at the rendezvous point, the receiver being handed across the water mattered so much. On the night of June 22nd into June 23, 1944, I-52 reached her assigned position, 15 degrees north, 40 degrees west, and surfaced beside the German submarine U-530, a Type 9C/40 boat on her own return leg from a resupply run. At 21:15 Greenwich Mean Time, the two crews worked lines and pontoons across open water in the dark, transferring crates by hand. Aboard came a German liaison officer, 2 German radio operators, an updated Kriegsmarine code, and a receiver called Naxos, FUMB-7, built specifically to hear the 10-centimeter wavelength that had been killing U-boats in the Bay of Biscay for the past year. If you watched our last video, you already know that story. Naxos was Germany's direct answer to the failure of the Metox. Commander Uno now believed his boat carried the cure for the exact disease that had already claimed 3 of his 5 predecessors. He did not know the disease had already mutated twice since the cure was designed. If this story is landing the way it should, hit the like button right now. It helps us keep making videos like this one. Part 3. Here is what nobody standing on I-52's bridge that night was ever told. The signal ordering the rendezvous, the date, the time, the coordinates, 15 north, 40 west, had already been intercepted and broken by American cryptanalysts before I-52 was anywhere near the meeting point. It was routed through the Ultra Channel to the submarine tracking room of the United States 10th Fleet, a section that referred to itself, on paper, only as the secret room. I-52 had been watched continuously since she passed through Singapore in the spring. On June 15, 1944, 8 days before the rendezvous even happened, a hunter-killer task group built around the escort carrier USS Bogue, 5 destroyer escorts, and Air Group VC-69, 9 FM-2 Wildcat fighters, and 12 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, sailed from Casablanca under Captain Aurelius B. Vossler with a single assignment. Not a patrol line, not a sweep of open water. 1 submarine, 1 set of coordinates, decoded and handed to them before she had even reached the rendezvous. None of this happened by accident, and it did not happen quickly. Breaking a naval code is not a single event. It is a factory. Teams of cryptanalysts, many of them working around the clock in shifts, extracted partial keys from thousands of intercepted messages, cross-referenced call signs, tracked traffic patterns, and rebuilt entire codebooks, 1 recovered group of digits at a time. The product of that factory did not arrive as a dramatic breakthrough. It arrived as a routine intelligence summary, filed alongside hundreds of others, that happened to contain a rendezvous point, a date, and a time. Nobody on I-52 could have imagined that a distant, windowless room full of American analysts had already read her captain's orders before he had. That kind of vulnerability does not look like a weakness from the inside of a submarine. It looks like nothing at all, because the compromise was invisible by design. This was not Bogue's first kill, and that matters more than it sounds like it should. Between April 1943 and March 1944, aircraft flying off Bogue, or the destroyer screening her, had already sent 8 German U-boats to the bottom of the Atlantic. U-569 in April, U-217 and U-118 in June, U-527 in July, U-86 in November, U-172 and U-580 in December, and U-575 that March. Every one of those kills used the same technology and the same doctrine as the story we told you last time. The 10-centimeter set descended directly from the copper block machined in a Birmingham basement in February 1940. The task force sent after I-52 in June 1944 was not improvising a new method against an unfamiliar target. It was running a doctrine that had already worked 8 times against the very nation that had, hours earlier, handed I-52 her supposedly current radar detector. No convoy escorted by Bogue ever lost a ship to a U-boat, and no aircraft flying from her deck was ever shot down by enemy action in the entire war, a record no other escort carrier group in any navy would match. Bogue herself had begun life as a merchant hull, laid down for commercial service and converted to an escort carrier under wartime pressure, the same story shared by nearly every ship in her class. She had no armor to speak of, and a flight deck barely long enough for an Avenger to get airborne. What she carried instead was radar, sonobuoys, a code-breaking pipeline reaching back to Washington, and a squadron that had already learned exactly how to use all 3 together, one U-boat at a time, for 14 months before a Japanese submarine ever entered the plot. Captain Aurelius Vossler, commanding the group from her bridge, was not chasing a lucky contact that night. He was closing out a method that had already been proven 8 times over. Part 4. The set closing on I-52 that night did not even use the wavelength Naxos was designed to catch. Naxos listened for signals between 9 and 10 centimeters, the exact band that had doomed the U-boats in the Bay of Biscay, and that the Germans had finally learned to detect by October 1943. But by June 1944, the Allies had already moved past it again. The radar mounted under the wing of the Avenger, hunting I-52, was called ASD, built by Philco from research done at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Radiation Laboratory, a facility founded in November 1940, within weeks of an Australian physicist named Edward Bowen opening a locked deed box in Washington and handing over the magnetron carried across the Atlantic during the Battle of Britain. Same invention, same lineage. 2 full generations further along, transmitting at 3 centimeters, a wavelength Naxos had never once been built to hear, now aimed 8,000 miles from where it was first switched on. By 1944, the radiation laboratory at MIT employed close to 4,000 people and was, by the reckoning of post-war historians, the second largest engineering effort of the American war after the atomic bomb itself. It had grown from a single briefcase carried off a ship in September 1940 into a pipeline that fed new radar sets to every theater at once. The ASD pod under Taylor's wing and the H-2S-derived set that killed U-665 in the Bay of Biscay a year earlier were, in every meaningful sense, siblings. Every submarine sent down the Yanagi route sailed believing its countermeasures were current. None of them were ever told that the gap between what the Allies could detect them with and what German engineers could warn them about had already reopened, twice, before their equipment even reached the water. The torpedo waiting at the end of that gap had its own quiet history. The Mark 24 had been developed at the Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory and built by Western Electric, and its existence was kept out of every public record until after the war, specifically so that no captured document could ever explain to a submarine crew what had actually killed them. Officially, it was a mine. Anyone who wrote otherwise in a wartime report risked a court-martial. By June 1944, it had already been used against German U-boats in the Atlantic, including the one that killed the decorated Kapitän Lieutenant Max Martin Teichert in U-456 the previous May. I-52 was hunted by a weapon whose real name her own captain would never have been permitted to learn. Dropped by pilots operating off a radar wavelength her escort had no way to hear, on the authority of a code her own government did not know was broken. At 23:40 hours, aviation radioman Ed Whitlock, flying as radar operator with pilot Lieutenant Commander Jesse Taylor, picked up a contact. His own set was only half functioning, one side of the sweep dead entirely. And it found her anyway. Taylor closed the range, laid a pattern of sonobuoys across roughly 1 square mile of open ocean, small hydrophones dropped by parachute that radioed sound back to the aircraft circling above, and through his headphones, he heard the unmistakable beat of I-52's propellers. At 23:50, he released a Mark 24 acoustic torpedo, an experimental weapon so classified it was logged in official records as a mine, one that homed on the sound of a ship's own screws, rather than a wake or a wire. His crew heard the explosion roll up through the water. I-52 was hit, and she dove. Picture the 30 seconds before that explosion from the other side. A 3-man Avenger crew, cramped into a cockpit and a belly turret, closing at low altitude in total darkness, on a contact their own instruments could barely confirm. And below them, a bridge watch standing exactly where the crew of the German boat in our last video stood, a year earlier and a continent away, trusting a dial that could not read the wavelength bearing down on it. Whatever order the officer of the watch gave when the sound of engines finally reached the bridge, it came after the aircraft was already committed, not before. Part 5. Taylor's patrol ended, and Lieutenant William Gordon relieved him at 0100, with a civilian underwater sound specialist named Price Fish riding in the aircraft to listen. Not long after, Fish caught a faint trace of propeller noise, still moving somewhere beneath the surface. Captain Vossler, watching the plot aboard Bogue, ordered a second attack. Gordon radioed Taylor to confirm the exact position of the original sonobuoy, and at 0154 dropped a second Fido into the dark water below it. At 0213, his crew heard the hull come apart, 3 miles down. Somewhere over the radio, a voice on one of the American aircraft said only, "We got that son of a bitch." 95 crew, 14 passengers, the engineers who had been bound for a German torpedo boat school, 3 German liaison personnel who had boarded from U-530 only hours before, 112 men, no survivors. I-52 came to rest 17,000 feet down, more than 3 miles below the surface, with 2 tons of gold still sealed in her forward hold. She stayed there, untouched, for 51 years. In 1995, an American researcher named Paul Tidwell, after a 5-year search built on a recovered Japanese cargo manifest and a re-navigation of the task force's own wartime position that corrected the Navy's original estimate by more than 10 miles, located the wreck on May 2, 1995. At the time, the deepest shipwreck search ever attempted. Work at 17,000 feet, Tidwell said afterward, is an immense undertaking. In 1998, small manned submersibles went back down and filmed the debris field. Shoes, personal effects, a hull mostly still upright on the bottom. A single sealed metal box was brought up in the hope that it held gold. It was opened on deck and found to contain opium instead. The Japanese government, treating the site as a war grave, required the recovery effort to proceed under negotiated protocols. The gold itself, worth roughly $25 million at the time of discovery, has never been brought to the surface. It is still down there now. The German submarine that delivered the Naxos receiver, U-530, made it home to France undetected. Her captain never learned what the equipment he had just handed across open water that night was actually worth, which was nothing, because the boat he gave it to had already been found, tracked, and scheduled to die before he had turned his own bow back east. At Nuremberg in May 1946, Karl Dönitz, the man who had commanded Germany's U-boats and lost his own son to this exact campaign of radar and air power, testified under oath about what had beaten him. The airplane, he said, the surprise by airplane, and the equipment of the planes with radar, which in my opinion is, next to the atomic bomb, the decisive war-winning invention of the Anglo-Americans, brought about the collapse of U-boat warfare. He was describing the Bay of Biscay. He could just as easily have been describing a moonless night 9,000 miles to the south, where the same invention, carried 2 radar generations further and aimed at a different ocean, found a Japanese submarine that believed, for exactly 2 hours, that it was finally safe. The verdict. Why couldn't Japanese submarine captains explain how American aircraft found them in total darkness? Because the equipment in their hands was never dishonest. Naxos really could hear 9 to 10 centimeters. It had been engineered properly, tested properly, and handed over in good faith by an ally who believed it was current. The failure was not in the machine. It was in the 2 years of silence between the moment a threat changed and the moment that change reached a bridge in the middle of the ocean. The Japanese Navy carried a receiver tuned to yesterday's danger. The Americans carried a broken code, a task force built for a single target, and a radar wavelength 3 generations removed from anything their new detector had ever been designed to hear. They remember the last routine surface run before Germany. They remember the exchange alongside U-530 in the dark, the German officer coming aboard, the new equipment being logged into the boat's inventory, the sense, for almost exactly 2 hours, that the hardest part of an 18,000-mile crossing was finally behind them. They remember believing a dial that read 0. Commander Uno never fired a shot back. 95 of his crew never fired a shot back. 14 engineers, who had never once been in combat, went down still carrying orders to report to a school in occupied France. None of them knew their route had been read since the day they left Singapore. None of them knew the wavelength had already changed, twice. None of them knew the fix in their hands, 2 hours old, was already history before it was ever switched on. 6 boats attempted the Yanagi crossing between Japan and Germany over 2 years. 130 reached France and was lost to a mine on the way home. 18 made the full round trip and survived. 134 was sunk within days of leaving Singapore. 129 delivered her cargo and was sunk returning, found by a submarine steered onto her by codebreakers. U-511 crossed safely and was formally handed over to the Japanese Navy. 152 never reached France at all. 4 of 6 ended in the ocean. 3 of those 4 were killed by an enemy that had already read the orders before the boat that carried them ever left port. Now you know what was in the file. Did your family serve in the Pacific Submarine War, on either side? Tell us their name in the comments below. And if you want the next chapter, because there are more of these, more receivers, more broken codes, more men who never knew what was listening, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.